am Pocho Salcedo. Welcome to our viewers and TV stations in Latin America and those who tune in from coast to coast across the continental United States and Hawaii. Here in New York, we are ready to decode the stories that shape our world. This is not just the news. This is the DNA of the news. Today, we will discuss two of the most notable cases of Cuban intelligence infiltration in the United States. North American government officials who were given significant trust in the development and influence of international politics for Cuba and Latin America in general turned out to be spies for the government of Havana, and that for several decades. This is the incredible story. Jim Popkin, welcome to the DNA of the news.
It's so great to be here. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
Jim Popkin is an investigative journalist whose work has appeared in The Washington Post, Wired, Newsweek, Slate, The Guardian, Washingtonian, and on National Public Radio. He started and ran the NBC News Investigative Unit, where he was a senior producer as well as an on-air correspondent. Popkin reported for NBC News for nearly 14 years, and his stories have appeared on NBC's Today Show, the NBC Nightly News, MSNBC, and CNBC. Popkin has won 4 National Emmy Awards for Outstanding Journalism, 2 Edward R. Murrow Awards, the George Polk Award, and was a finalist for the National Magazine Award. He received a BA from Northwestern University and a master's in law from Yale Law School, and lives in Washington, D.C.
Jim, with your help, we will unpack two of the most incredible and potentially damaging instances of infiltration of Cuban espionage at high levels of the security and diplomatic apparatus of the United States. Recently, federal judge Beth Bloom in Florida, sentencing former U.S. Ambassador Manuel Rocha, said, "This country put its trust in you and you turn your back on the country." But let us start with one of those stories. Ana Belén Montes, you're the author of Codename Blue Wren, the true story of America's most dangerous female spy and the sister she betrayed. This remarkable book gets like no other to the DNA of this story, the impact of her decision on her life and her family, and of course, the nation she swore to defend.
Well, thanks again for having me on. I really love talking about this topic because I'm so passionate about it. I first learned about the arrest of Ana Montes in 2001, the September 2001, right after 9/11. And at the time, I was a reporter for NBC News in Washington and covering the FBI and the aftermath of 9/11. So it was a really busy time. Pardon me. And I learned about her arrest, but I really couldn't do very much about it at the time because I stood for spying on behalf of Cuba. And they said, yeah, I saw it, but I couldn't really do anything with it. And then he told me she bought my condo in Washington. And I realized that I had spent so much time in that apartment unit that where Ana later lived. And it just connected me. I could see her apartment. I could see the neighborhood, the Cleveland Park neighborhood of Washington near the zoo. And it just got me interested and hooked in the story. And I began to pursue it. I reached out to the FBI and the agents who worked on the case and was off to the races. Ultimately wrote about it for the Washington Post and then later wrote a book, as you mentioned, that came out called Codename Blue Wren.
So what initially drew you to the story of Ana Belén Montes, and how did you come across this fascinating yet troubling real-life spy drama?
It's an incredible family story, and that's really what drew me to this. The spy part of it's amazing too. Like, this is, at the end of the day, a family story. So I'll start with the father you mentioned, Alberto Montes. Born in Puerto Rico, brilliant, first in his family to go to college. became a medical doctor and then went to the army right away. So ultimately retired from the army as a colonel. He was a very proud man, very bright, but also very abusive at home, especially towards his young children and his wife, Anna's mother. So they grew up with as someone with a very unpredictable, explosive temper, who would beat the kids when they were 5 years old with a belt if they did any normal thing that kids would do, spilling, talking up, that kind of thing. And it had a very big impact on Anna. Ironically, Dr. Montes became a Freudian psychoanalyst. And so you would think, of all people to be compassionate to his children, it should have been him. But he was very, very hard on the kids, and particularly on Anna, and that stayed with her the rest of her life. In terms of the family, as you mentioned, totally coincidentally, Anna's one sister, Lucy, decided to work for the FBI. She made that decision the same week that Anna decided secretly to begin spying for Cuba. So you have the two sisters going in different directions. Lucy ended up in Miami, which has the FBI field office that works mostly, or of all the field offices in the U.S., is responsible mostly for finding Cuban agents in the U.S., obviously because of Miami. She ultimately was assigned to a special unit that was dedicated to trying to find Cuban spies. And ironically, her sister, Anna, was at the time, and Lucy didn't know it, was the most prominent Cuban spy of all time, Castro's greatest recruit and asset. Anna worked for the Defense Department. It's called the DIA, Defense Intelligence Agency, and it's basically like the CIA for the Pentagon, generating intelligence that our American warfighters can use. And she rose up the ranks and became a top analyst. And at the same time, her sister's in Miami in a unit trying to find Cuban spies. It's incredible. She marries another FBI employee, and then she thinks, this is such a nice place to work. I'm going to encourage my brother and sister-in-law to work here too. And they both end up as FBI special agents. So her brother Alberto or Tito, becomes an FBI special agent in Atlanta, and his then wife, Joan, also. So at one point, you have the father in the military, and then 4 family members of Anna, the spy, all in the FBI. And I just like to think about their Thanksgiving when friends from the FBI would come over. People are putting down their guns and their badges before they had the meal, and next to them sits Ana Montes, Castro's secret agent.
Jim, this is an amazing story, and what makes your book so compelling is that you connect all those human situations, which makes it the story even more powerful. For example, when Anna was uncovered 17 years later, on September 21st of 2001, the reaction of her colleagues was powerful because in the midst of them, they had someone who was spying for Cuba.
Many of them broke down and cried. It was a horrifying betrayal of their trust and faith. One of her colleagues told me, I felt like my entire job for the last dozen years was a total waste. Everything I did made its way back to Cuba and to the Castro brothers, as fast as possible. So everything that they were doing to try to, it's spy versus spy world, but everything that the Americans in the Defense Department were trying to do was immediately known in Cuba. One of the things that Anna did, which was very, very dangerous, was she turned over the real names of Americans, presumably CIA agents or recruits, working in Havana, the true names. They could have been killed, they could have been imprisoned, Instead, Cuba played the long game and just kept an eye on them. And you can imagine how helpful that would be to know if, Jose is a spy. I know that, but he doesn't know that I know. We'll let him do whatever he wants. We're going to keep watching him. And his job is going to be useless because of that. And so that's what happened. She turned over that information. She turned over secret spy satellite information and everything else she could get her hands on, over a 17-year career. She was incredibly harmful. So when her colleagues learned, many of them cried. And how about poor Lucy? On that day, the arrest day, in September of 2001, she's brought into her boss's office, sat down. She thinks that she's going to get a new assignment related to 9/11. And instead they tell her, we've just arrested your sister in Washington. Your sister is a Cuban spy. Lucy could not believe it. And she fought it at first, thought they were making it up. And then slowly she accepted it. And then she had this incredible emotion where she thought, oh my goodness, relief. Now I understand why Anna has been so closed with me for so many years, wouldn't share information, would cry sometimes out of the blue, had so much pressure on her. Lucy assumed, or it has to be me. My sister doesn't like me anymore. And she never thought, well, the reason my sister's under so much psychological stress is because she's spying, and that's stressful.
So Ana Montes was detained on September 21st, 2001, but the FBI already knew she was a spy, and they were keeping an eye on her for some months. Why that day?
Yeah, the FBI got onto her about a year earlier, and there are many cooks in the kitchen on that. There were a number of other agencies that helped develop the information that the FBI then confirmed. And the reason that they knew she was a spy was they got legal approval to enter her apartment, to break into her apartment essentially, in 2001. And when they were in there, they found her laptop, they copied the hard drive, and they realized that Anna had very sloppily left some computer files showing conversations back and forth with the Cuban intelligence agency, the DGI. That was very damning and incriminating. But what they really wanted was to catch her in the act. They wanted to see her pass a document or meet with a Cuban handler. It never happened. And then, they knew they had a spy within the Pentagon, and they kept her there. But then once 9/11 happened, the head of her agency, DIA, said, that's it. We're helping the nation go to war against the Taliban. But that's with the left hand. With the right hand, I have a known Cuban spy working for me. I can't do everything. And the admiral told the FBI, you have 10 days to either arrest her or we're going to fire her. And so they had a deadline. They were waiting to see if she met with a Cuban or passed a document. It didn't happen. And because of 9/11, it added all this added pressure. And then they arrested her on September 21st, 2001.
Jim, this is truly amazing. Anna was also a very dedicated and systematic practitioner of her craft. She worked for the DIA in the Pentagon during the day, and during the night, she conveyed what she memorized of the documents, and she never took any documents out of the Pentagon.
Yeah, Juan Carlos, she basically had two jobs, right? So during the day, she's working at the Pentagon at the DIA, and she'd stay at her desk, she'd grab her lunch, and she would type all day. And what she's doing is she's studying and writing and memorizing what was important, she thought would be important to Cuba. As you said, she didn't take the risk of taking documents out of the building. That would be very risky because they check your bags. Often the security agents do. So she kept it in her head. Then at night, she would come home. She had her condominium in the Cleveland Park section of Washington, D.C. She would come home and job 2 starts, and she would type up in Spanish in her laptop the notes from the day, and everything was encrypted with software that the Cubans had provided. So for 17 years, she's doing this. She's uploading a ton of information. And then the way that she would transmit that would be she'd put things on a floppy disk, and she would have a dinner once or a couple times a month with her handler, her Cuban handler, who's basically an undercover agent, works for Cuba but not known to the U.S. government, might be posing as a businessman or that kind of thing. And they would eat often in Chinese restaurants in Washington, and she would slip this floppy disk, and then they would decrypt it on the other end, and her notes would be there, everything she'd learned over the past couple of weeks. She got her information in a very old school way with a shortwave radio. And the way that works is you'd have someone in a sound studio in Havana. Typically it was a woman, and she would just read numbers, a series of numbers into a microphone. So it would be 33200.
5, 6, 2, 8, 4, 6, 6, 1, 4, 4, 5, 5, 8, 6, 1.
And over again, she would repeat these numbers, a series of them, 150 sets of numbers. If you don't have the code, it's meaningless, it's gibberish. But if you do have the code, you write down the numbers. And Anna would do this. She would sit in her apartment, listen with a headpiece like this, and listen on her shortwave radio, and then type the numbers into her laptop, and out would come her directions for the week. And that's how the Cubans transmitted information to Anna, and there are other spies. Many spy agencies do it that way. So she was an intense person who worked hard during the day, had very few friends at work, was not nice to many people, was very rough and rude often to people at work. And then she came home and she had this life of solitude. She never married. She had a couple boyfriends over the years, but she devoted herself to this work and to being an incredibly effective spy.
Jim, the damage inflicted by Ana Belén often went beyond Cuban direct interests of the uncovering of the spies, or what was going to happen to Cuba. Tell us about the satellite system called Misty, one of the classified projects compromised by Montes.
Yeah, well, intelligence officials will describe her as one of the most damaging spies that we've ever had in the country. And one of the reasons why is she turned over information about a super secret satellite system that the U.S. government was operating that was spying on Cuba, but not just Cuba, on Russia, China, Iran, etc. And it had stealth capabilities, so it could hide itself. Normally, satellites, you can track their path. And so if you're a government and you don't want another government to see you, you know when the satellite is coming, you can move equipment out of the way. In this case, this satellite, codenamed Misty, you couldn't track it. And Anna learned about it. She got a top secret briefing and turned right around and told the Cubans. The problem with that is that the Cubans often sell or trade information to Russia and other enemies. So it compromised that program and was just a nightmare for the U.S. government.
Well, and now we switch to a parallel story, the story of Manuel Rocha, former ambassador of the United States in Bolivia, and also he held many high-level positions in the Department of State.
Yeah, I mean, it's fascinating, and it really speaks to the competence of the Cuban intelligence service. It's known as DGI. It's their version of the CIA. They're really good. They're small, they're scrappy, and their main enemy, of course, and target is the United States. So they focus a lot of their energy on that. But think about that. They meet Rocha in 1973 in Chile. He recently admitted, he was just last week was sentenced, and at his sentencing, he admitted that he became politically radicalized when he was at Yale University. And then he goes to Chile. You're right, during the Allende period, and they approach him, and he agrees to start spying. But this is how good and patient the Cuban intelligence services. They'd wait for a decade, basically, until he enters the State Department. And he gets in the State Department and works his way up and ends as a U.S. ambassador, his last posting in Bolivia. And the entire time he's spying for Cuba. That is extreme patience to place an agent, infiltrate an agent into the State Department, wait until he goes through all the schooling, gets in, and then he has a natural progression, does better and better in his career, and is secretly spying the entire time. Just an amazing story, and interesting the parallels between Rocha and Anamontes, both politically radicalized in university, essentially, and then placed by the Cubans in the Pentagon and the State Department and allowed to go and do their thing, which turned out to be very harmful to the United States.
What was your first reaction? You were familiar with Anamontes, spying for 17 years, and then we found out that there had been another spy working inside the U.S. government for 40 years. What does this say about the Cubans' work and the inability of the United States to detect spies and infiltration?
I'm impressed with their patience and how clever they are. There's another spy we haven't talked about named Kendall Myers, another American who also was at the State Department, also spied for Cuba. He's serving a life sentence right now in Supermax. He and his wife were arrested and both in prison. Cuba had, clearly had a lot of Americans on their payroll working as spies. They are a good spy agency. My belief is that there were and are more that we just don't know about. It stands to reason that they're out there. So, this really was a passion project for Fidel Castro. He was interested in knowing everything that he could about what the Americans were doing in his island nation, and also, anything that could harm his regime. And by the way, for good reason, as you and your viewers know, for many, many years, the American government sought to assassinate Castro. So he was very paranoid about what would happen and devoted a lot of resources to putting spies in place in high positions in the U.S. government and trying to learn everything he could about what the U.S. had in mind in Cuba.
Let's look at the role of Ambassador Rocha. In June of 2002, while he was an ambassador in Bolivia, Rocha warned Bolivians that electing leftist coca farmer Evo Morales, a protege of Fidel Castro as president, would be chaotic and destroy the relationship with the United States. Well, the Bolivians reacted to that, and they elected Evo Morales. This intervention was credited with helping boost Morales' standing in the polls. He thanked Rocha for being his best campaign chief. From that point on, Bolivia became one of Cuba's closest allies. Even he has expelled the ambassador of the United States. Shortly after, when he was in power, Evo Morales got very close to Cuba, and Rocha had a big impact on this.
Right. At the time, it was seen as a diplomatic mistake what he did. Right. In retrospect, it probably was a plan, a strategy to support Morales. It's fascinating. The other thing that is so interesting about Rocha is after he left office, he got into business, and he's been posing recently as a Trump supporter, a big MAGA fan. And he's admitted that that was all a lie, just a way to hide in plain sight and act like he supported Trump, when in reality, he clearly supported the Cuban regime and communism.
What broad messages should the United States and its allies take from the Ana Belén and Manuel Rocha espionage cases?
Well, I think one of the lessons is that the Cubans have a very professional spy service. They're very motivated. And while we as Americans, as a nation, don't need to fear them in terms of their military, we do in terms of their intelligence work. And we should be looking for more Cuban infiltration and take this threat more seriously. Because when, there are 2 or 3 we mentioned today, there are very likely many more. And, I think the FBI and State Department are now doing a damage assessment of what Rocha did in his time. And I'm sure that they're also looking back and trying to see, were there other people, other spies at the same time that we just have not yet learned about?
Both had high position of trust and access to restricted information. Montes and Analyst and Rocha as an ambassador. Good information for a long time. One 17 years, the other 40 years. We wonder what we don't know yet.
Yeah, exactly. Especially in the Ana Montes case, she was given a polygraph. In both cases with both of these spies, there were security failings along the way. In the case of Ana Montes, she had confided to a colleague a long time ago her true feelings about her politics regarding the United States. That colleague shared that information with the FBI and said that Ana didn't seem loyal to the United States. That information was known and ignored. What I'm interested in knowing with Rocha is, was there anything similar? What happened? What did they learn when they did a security check on him all the way back to the 1970s? Did they learn anything else that they also ignored regarding his politics and his ideology? That would be part of the damage assessment that will be done now that he's pled guilty and has been sentenced.
Jim, thank you. Having a dialogue with you has been an absolute honor. You're a true expert. Thank you very much for joining us at the DNA of the News.
Thank you so much, Juan Carlos. Really enjoyed it, and it's a great topic, and thank you so much for having me on to talk about it.